I'm Allie from the Allegheny County Library System. Welcome in and thank you for joining us tonight. You may have noticed whenever you came in that you should have gotten an alert saying that this event is being recorded. And if you didn't, I'm here to tell you that this event is being recorded. That is mostly because if for some reason you have to miss something, or if you want to revisit this, or if you want to share it with friends and family, we are going to have it on the ACLS YouTube and it will be shared on Facebook within the next few days. So just a way to revisit in the future. There will also hopefully be a record of the chat so that we can share that in a Word format as well. You may have also noticed that you are muted and we ask that you stay muted during the presentation. There will be time for questions at the end, and you are welcome, more than welcome, to chat in the chat box throughout the thing and just share your thoughts and feelings, and just be respectful if you choose to do so. If you want to sit back and enjoy the presentation, you are more than welcome to as well. Participation is not required. So we hope that you enjoy tonight's events. And now I'm going to have Regina come on and welcome on our speaker.
Hi, hello and welcome. I'm so glad you could join us here at the Georges Creek Regional Library in our Zoom event of Buzz 1-4 and the nuclear-armed B-52 crash in 1964. Some of you may have grown up like I did. I listened to my dad talking about it from when he was young. I was a wee little girl, so I have no distinct memories of it. But if I didn't say before, I'm Regina, and I help run the branch here in Lonaconee. I'd like to also welcome our presenter, Bucky Shriver. Bucky is a local historian and has been involved in several major historical projects, including the Lefty Grove Memorial Park and the Coal Miner Memorial Projects. He's been a resident of the Georges Creek area for most of his life. Bucky has devoted countless hours to learn about this tragic event that we locals still talk about to this day, even meeting with both families of the survivors and those who perished in the crash. So welcome, Bucky. We're really glad to have you for our event tonight.
Thank you, Regina, and thanks for everybody for joining in. Just to start with, I want to give you a little background on my history with this crash. My history with this thing, my exposure to it, kind of came in two different phases, separated by 49 years. I'll explain that as I go along. I was a few weeks short of my 9th birthday. We lived in a little town called Moscow in Georges Creek when this happened. And so I have some distinct memories of this. My most distinct memories, I remember standing around our radio on the kitchen counter, listening to the hourly updates on WFRB radio with anticipation, hoping that they would announce that these guys had been rescued, because, and I still remember how terrible the weather was that night, even by mountain Maryland standards. And our weather is much worse than the eastern parts of the state, but even by our standards, it was terrible that night. And I still remember when we were in Barton Elementary School in, I was in 2nd grade, 1962, during the Cuban crisis, and having to go through the civil defense drills where they would take us down to the lowest part of the school, which was near an archway that led into the gymnasium. And they would show you how to get down on your knees, and you get almost like in a fetal position where you would put your head down and cover your head with your hands. I'm not sure how much that was good, how much good that was going to do if you were anywhere close to a nuclear bomb. But I still remember that. And there have been 3 documentaries done on this. Now this, like I say, this was a hot topic of conversation, obviously, for probably a year after the crash, and then people start to go back to their normal lives. And of course, nobody who lived through it ever forgot it. But then the story became revived about the time of the 50th commemoration. But and there were 3 documentaries done. One was done by Mountain Ridge High School, the historical research methods class. Another one by Renee Green, and then there was another one done by Matt McCormick, who was the grandson of the pilot of Buzz 1-4. But for those who are just kind of, finding out about this or didn't get a chance to see the documentaries, I'm going to start by covering the whole timeline of this plane. This plane was part of Operation Chrome Dome, which was a contingent of nuclear armed bombers that were on 24-hour airborne alert as a nuclear deterrent. This all kind of peaked about the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, whenever Russia got caught trying to sneak intercontinental ballistic missiles into Cuba. And there was like a 13-day standoff between Khrushchev and Kennedy. And thankfully, it resulted in a diplomatic resolution. But I think we were closer to nuclear war than we ever had been before or since. So anyhow, the timeline of this plane, this plane took off from Turner Air Force Base in Albany, Georgia on January 7th. The mission of this plane would have been to fly across the ocean. It would have gone into its rotation pattern over Turkey. And had they gotten the go code from Strategic Air Command headquarters in Nebraska, their mission would have been to fly into southern Russia and drop these bombs on an air base in Tbilisi in the Georgia province of southern Russia. And then they would have crash landed this plane in the Iranian desert and waited to be rescued, assuming that there was a world to come back to. Well, their plans went awry from the start because they had engine problems. They had to land this plane at Moran Air Force Base in Spain for repairs, and it was there for several days. And while this plane was on the ground in Spain, another B-52 took off from Wichita, Kansas, which was the headquarters of Boeing at the time. This plane that took off from Wichita had 4 Boeing engineers on board, and it was a test flight. They had sensors on the fuselage of this plane, the purpose of which was to test this plane, test the fuselage of the plane against buffeting turbulence. Well, they flew this plane over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains of New Mexico, where a B-52 had gone down because of structural failure almost a year before. Well, these engineers got more of a realistic reenactment than they wanted, because although this was a B-52H model, which was the latest model that had the shortened tail and the stronger bulkhead, it broke the vertical stabilizer off of this plane too, and it nearly rolled over on its back, and they were barely able to save it. And they with the help of with officers on the ground in Wichita, they were able to stabilize this plane. And when they got back to Wichita, the winds were so high they couldn't land it, so they had to go back to Blitheville, Arkansas. But the advantage that this plane had with these Boeing engineers on board is that they were flying during daytime, and they were flying during clear weather. Well, anyhow, this will play into this whole thing as you go along. But so on January 11th, Buzz 1-4 took off, this B-52 took off from Spain with the intent of flying back to Turner Air Force Base in Georgia. Well, because of a storm out over the ocean, they diverted the plane to Chicopee or Westover Air Force Base in Chicopee, Massachusetts. Well, there was a crew that was assembled from Turner Air Force Base, a 5-man crew that flew up to Westover to retrieve this plane. Well, before they could take off from Westover, they had problems with the oxygen system. So it wasn't fixed until late that day. So this plane, Buzz 14, took off from Westover at 12:31 a.m. and on what they thought would be an easy mission. And when they passed, what they did, now the standard navigation at that time was VOR, which stands for Very High Frequency Omnidirectional Range. They had, these beacons were just scattered everywhere, and these beacons would send a radio signal, and the planes had a receiver where they could dial the frequency of this beacon in, and there was a course deviation indicator. And as long as that pilot had that beacon center, that course deviation indicator centered, he would fly right over that beacon. And when it flew over the beacon, a little window in the instrument would go from to from to show that they had crossed over that beacon. Then they would dial the next one. Well, the first beacon they crossed was Albany, New York, and then they zeroed in on Phillipsburg. And after they crossed the beacon there at Phillipsburg, the pilot started reporting light turbulence, and he said no problem. And about a minute or so later, 2 minutes later, he started reporting moderate turbulence, and this kind of initiated a back and forth with the air traffic controllers, asking him if he wanted to change his altitude. And the air traffic controllers contacted United Flight 825, which had just departed out of Philadelphia, and the pilot reported light to moderate turbulence at the lower elevations. And so the pilot said, he said, well, I'll descend to 290, 29,000 feet. And the air traffic controller said, if that doesn't work for you, we'll raise you back up. Well, at 1:38 in the morning, the pilot, Thomas McCormick, was descending, and he came on and he said, we're at 300, which is 30,000 feet, and descending, and we're still in it. And there was a note of frustration in his voice. And he said he was climbing back to 310, 31,000 feet. Well, the air traffic controller said, well, stand by 1 minute. I'm talking with another aircraft. And he got back to Buzz 14 and gave him clearance to climb to 31,000 feet. And someone from that plane keyed the mic, but the response was indecipherable. So the air traffic controller got back to the plane again and asked, do you copy? And someone keyed the mic again, and the response was indecipherable again. But when they played the recordings of the radio transcripts later, they could hear air rushing in the background in that second transmission, which tells me that Melvin Wooten had already blown his hatch off. And I think it's almost without question, that's where the air was coming from. And then these guys started to egress this airplane. Melvin Wooten had to have ejected almost immediately, because if you go on to, there's a good website when this is all over with you, if you want a good source of information, the best source of information out there is a guy that was on our little committee, John Jocelyn. And John assembled all the information. I gave him some photos and stuff, but he assembled this. He paid all the expenses of creating and maintaining that website. But the website is buzz14.org. That's all letters, no numbers. BUZZONEFOUR.org. There's a video interview with the co-pilot. There's you can download a copy of the Air Force crash report. The transcripts of the radio transmissions are in there and everything. But some of this information that I'm giving you here, you go on to that website, Buzz14. You can open the Air Force crash report and go to page 17. There's a map on there that's titled Crew and Survival Pattern, Survival Gear Scatter Pattern. And it looks a little crude, but if you open that map next to Google satellite, you can easily identify these roads on that map. And especially if you go with the geographic coordinates that are also marked on that map. And so I know where all these guys landed at. Melvin Wooten landed in a field in West Salisbury, Pennsylvania. And apparently he had come into contact, obviously he had come into contact when he ejected with some broken pieces of that plane, because he had a compound fracture of his left leg. And his family told me that he had other injuries besides that. He had cuts on his chest and his hands. Well, he landed in that field, and the weather was just terrible up there. And he saw a light on the other side that he was trying to crawl to in West Salisbury, but he didn't realize at the time that the Castleman River was between him and that light. And unbeknownst to him, there were houses that were 200 yards behind him, but he couldn't see them because 1:42 in the morning was the official time of the crash. And he couldn't see them because it was just, obviously it was dark, but then you had that the heavy snow. So he crawled toward what I think was a street light over there on West Salisbury in Salisbury, Pennsylvania. But when he came to that river, I don't know if he didn't realize it was a river. He thought it would support his weight. The ice would support his weight. He tried to crawl across that river and he fell in. He didn't have the strength to pull himself out, and he froze to death in that river. He was the last one found on Friday, the 17th, because he was so far, quite a bit farther north than these other crew members were. But if you look at that scatter pattern map on buzz14.org, you'll see they have the seat that Melvin Wooten was sitting in. It landed, they have it marked, it landed right across from the VOR beacon in Grantsville, which tells me that plane was pretty much on course whenever he bailed. He bailed very early, which, you know, and that thing's coming apart like that, you want to get out of it. But anyhow, I took my GPS unit and I measured the distance between where Melvin Wooten's body was found and that seat. And it's 9 miles. His seat went 9 miles farther than what he did. These guys bailed out of this plane. If you look at the interview with the co-pilot on the Buzz14 website, there's a link on the homepage where you can click on it and listen to that interview. And he testified that plane was flying about 500 miles an hour. Now, obviously, this thing started coming apart. It lost some of its speed. But with the engine still running wide open and that thing going downward, I'm sure that it maintained the majority of its speed. So these guys, when they ejected out of that plane, they were propelled quite a distance forward before their parachutes even opened. These parachutes had a barometric control on them that were set to open at 14,000 feet. But that's 14,000 feet barometric, 14,000 feet above mean sea level, not 14,000 feet above the ground. And the area, the elevation at the crash site was 2,600 feet. All that top of those mountains up in Garrett County are over 2,000 feet. So, and these parachutes, once they were deployed, they would descend. The guy under that parachute, he would descend at about 1,500 feet a minute. So they were suspended under parachutes another 6 to 8 minutes under with a northeast wind. So I don't think it's unreasonable to speculate that these guys could have easily been carried 10 to 15 miles south or southwestward from where they bailed out of this plane at. But anyhow, the second, well, the pilot landed about 2.5 miles south of Melvin Wooten. I was going to say he was the second one out of the plane, but I don't think he was. He landed 4 miles north of where the co-pilot did, but the pilot testified that when he ejected, he was fumbling around trying to find the ripcord just in case the barometric control didn't work on that parachute, and he accidentally pulled it, and he said it felt like it nearly pulled him in half. So that needless to say, that greatly arrested his forward motion. And this is speculation, obviously, but I think that the pilot and the co-pilot being side by side, I think he told the co-pilot Parker Peden to eject. And as soon as he did, he went immediately after. And then in the bottom of the plane, well, first of all, Melvin Wooten wasn't sitting in the tail gunner's seat. There were only 5 crew members on this plane. And on this B-52, there was no ejection seat for the tail gunner, not in this D model. If he had to evacuate the plane, what he would have done is he would have pulled a lever, and that back end of that plane, that pod would have fallen off, and he would have dove out. Of course, he'd had a parachute, but since there was no ECM officer on that plane, ECM stands for electronic countermeasures. It's the electronic warfare officer's seat, and that seat was located behind. It faced forward, and it was behind the pilot and co-pilot. So Melvin Wooten ejected. He was in one of the upward ejecting seats, and that seat is still on display at the Frostburg Museum. And so the pilot landed 2.5 miles from south of where Melvin Wooten did. Another 4 miles south. This is Melvin Wooten's ejection seat in the you can see the letters and numbers. It says 55 on an ECM 55060, which was the tail number of the plane. And like I said, ECM was electronic countermeasures. But and then the next one, like I say, was Robert Payne. Now, Robert Payne and Robert Townley were sitting in the lower part of the plane, down in the belly. It was kind of below and to the rear of where the co-pilot and the pilot were sitting. And these two seats, these two crew members in the belly of that plane, what was known as a black hole, they would eject down. And when they initiated this ejection sequence, they would pull up on the handle of that ejection seat. The first thing it would do, it would blow the hatch off. And with these lower level ejection seats, there would be cuffs that would come out, and it would lock around your ankles. Because if not, it would break your legs coming out. Your legs would fly out. Well, Robert Townley was the bombardier on this plane. The navigator who was sitting beside Townley was Robert Payne. Robert Townley and Robert Payne. Well, Townley had been out of his seat shortly before this plane got caught up in this turbulence, and he asked for permission to use the latrine, which was granted. There's no reason at that point not to. But this all happened so quickly, he got back in his seat, but he couldn't get all of his belt strapped in order to eject. And there's been speculation, obviously this can't be known, but there's been speculation, and I think it's reasonable to speculate that Robert Payne was probably trying to help Robert Townley get strapped in, and which is the reason why he was the last one out of the plane. Robert Payne landed only 2.5 miles from where this plane went down, which would lead you to think that he waited till the very last minute to eject. But like I say, you have to consider that he was propelled quite a ways through the air before that parachute opened. And then the wind being from the northeast, it carried him farther. So he didn't wait quite as long as, it would appear. But anyhow, Townley never got out of the plane, and he went down with the plane, and it crashed on Savage Mountain, which is about 4 air miles from Lonaconing at 1:42 a.m. And one of the ways they were able to corroborate the time of the crash, and this always impressed me with what a cold character the co-pilot was, when he was descending under his parachute, he had the presence of mind to look at his watch, and he said it was 1:42 a.m. My my mother was actually looking out the back window of our house when this plane crashed. My father worked at the Kelly Springfield Tire Company in Cumberland, and he was working the delay shift, the cat-eye shift, and she had put him off to work. And I guess she always stayed up and did crossword puzzles and read Reader's Digest and so forth. But she rarely ever stayed up this long, till 1:42 a.m. I'm guessing that she knew there wouldn't be any school the next day. So she was getting ready to go to bed at 1:42 a.m. And she was looking out the back window of our house. And it's kind of ironic she would say this, but she said, or she saw that orange fireball, and she said she thought the world was coming to an end. And it's kind of an interesting statement, considering this plane was carrying 2 Mark 53 9-megaton nuclear bombs. Each one of these bombs was 600 times more powerful than what they dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. And this is the newspaper headline from the Cumberland Times the next day. And obviously, they, in those terrible conditions, they presumed that had none of them had survived this accident. But this was not the if you look at the timeline of this crash, you can go back to this Air Force crash report, and all of the radio transmissions are time stamped. They showed the landing sites of the crew members, you know, the speed of the plane. I think that this, obviously this will be a mystery, what happened from the time the tail separation until it hit the ground. But I do think you can shed a little light on this. If you look at, like I say, if you look at the radio communications and the speed of the plane, this thing came apart well north of Myersdale, where that if you take the speed of the plane and measure backwards by the time, my guess is it was probably up around Berlin, Pennsylvania, where this thing ran into this serious trouble. And the last 8 miles of the course of this plane, it was shedding major parts. We've got some short video clips of some of the debris. The vertical stabilizer landed in the woods. Now this, a friend of mine, Leo Mills, gave me this. It was shot with 8mm video. And this is a piece of the fuselage that detached from that plane and knocked down a big section of woods about half a mile before the plane hit the ground. And you'll see the camera man scans around and looks back north toward Avilton, and you can see the huge swath of trees that that this piece knocked down. Yeah, you'll see it here in a second. Okay, there you can see that huge swath of trees that thing knocked down, and that was close to the crash site. This thing was, the whole 1/3 of the back of that plane was gone by the time it hit the ground. So obviously it took a severe nose down attitude whenever it hit the ground. Now we've got this is the crash debris. Some of the crash debris was buried at the site. Most was hauled away. This was at the Frostburg Armory, and you can see the huge piles of debris from this plane. And it was stored there for a while and then hauled away to, I don't know where. But there were just massive piles of debris. And here at the end of this clip, it's coming up here, you can see the engines off of the plane laying here. Yeah, there are the engines off of the plane. I think there might have been another video clip of the vertical stabilizer. but the vertical stabilizer detached and landed in the woods alongside of Green Lantern Road. And it split a tree and it stood straight up. And later, I think they knocked it down to keep it from falling on someone. But the vertical stabilizer, now this is the B-52D. This is the model. I don't think this was the same color scheme as the one that crashed, but this is the B-52D. And what's surprising, I mean, this plane was a really big plane. This plane was bigger than that 757 that was hijacked and crashed at Shanksville in 2001. This plane was bigger. This was called the C scheme, which was popular with that B-50. It was exclusive to that B-52D. And they had, I remember back in the 60s, they would have these fallout shelter signs, and they would have the capacity of the number of people that these fallout shelters could accommodate. And yeah, it was just a really tense time back then. And like I say, I think we were closer to nuclear war than we ever had been before or since. And well, anyhow, this obviously initiated an intense search for these crew members. And the day of the crash, later the day of the crash, the pilot walked out of the woods east of Grantsville, and he had come down on an old strip job. And for people that are familiar with the area, it's on the north end of, there's a housing development there now called Highlands Development. And it's on the north end of that near the Pennsylvania border. That's all marked on that crew and debris, or the crew and survival gear scatter pattern map. It's marked where he came down. Well, he had to walk 2.5 miles the next day through deep snow. He got come out, finally came to a farm, Robert Warnick's farmhouse, which is the Tomlinson's own house in Grantsville, near Grantsville. And he walked there and found refuge, and they took him in and helped him. And Trooper Joe Stakem from Midland, state trooper, picked Thomas McCormick up and took him to the hospital. At that time, the storm was so bad that the Civil Air Patrol planes and the aircraft were still not able to fly. The Civil Air Patrol planes did not get up until Tuesday afternoon. Well, the second crew member that was found, and there were only two survivors, the pilot and co-pilot. The second crew member, co-pilot Parker Peden, landed along some power lines not far from New Germany Road, 4 miles south of where Thomas McCormick had landed. Well, when the sky cleared up Tuesday afternoon, the Civil Air Patrol planes got flying, and one of them spotted a parachute near New Germany Road. And he did a low pass over this parachute, and Parker Peden had a signal mirror that he saw him. And Parker Peden always said that he would never forget the tail number of that plane, 370 Charlie. He said it was 370 Charlie. Well, they dispatched a helicopter that picked Parker Peden up and took him to the hospital. Well, later that same day, this was Tuesday afternoon, Townley's body was found in the wreckage. And also, after they found the co-pilot, Lester Bittinger, who lived on Fairview Road, left that scene where they had brought that co-pilot out, and he went back home. Well, where Lester Bittinger lives, if you climb the top of the hill behind his house, you can look down through that Poplar Valley. Well, since he had just cleared up, he walked up to the top of that hill and looked down through that valley, and he saw another parachute. And so he went back and told those guys. So they assembled two groups of men, about 10 in each group. One came from the Savage River Road end of the Poplar Lick Trail. Another one went out Fairview Road, went down through the woods, and came from the north end. Well, by the time these guys got assembled and got everything they needed, it was after dark. and the temperature was probably close to zero or below zero, because it got very cold on that second day when the sky cleared up. Well, these guys hiked down through those woods, and they found Robert Payne's body after a few hours. They found his parachute, and they followed his tracks where he had walked away from the parachute and back, and then away again, and they found him. And I talked to two guys who have since passed, Junior Brenneman and Gary Finsel, that were on that search team that found him. And Gary told me that Robert Payne had a jacket on with a hood on it. He said, but it was so thin that it wouldn't keep you warm on a cold summer night. Since this was an impromptu flight just to get that plane back to Turner Air Force Base, these guys didn't have time to get their winter flight gear. The only ones that had winter flight gear are the pilot and co-pilot. And of course, in Townley's case, it didn't matter because he went down with the plane. And I'm sure in Wooten's case, it wouldn't matter. But it might have made a difference with Robert Payne. Whenever he came down, Robert Payne, his parachute got stuck in the tree. Well, when he cut himself down, his survival gear stayed stuck up in the tree. So not only was he in one of the most densely forested, dark places in this part of the country, but now he had no survival gear either. And anyhow, these guys initiated that search. They found him, and they had taken a blanket with them with hopes of finding him alive, because when they found the co-pilot, they went in to bring the co-pilot out. When he was found, the co-pilot had taken his life raft. He had turned it upside down like he was trained to do, put it on the ground to create a pocket of air underneath the life raft in order to insulate himself from that cold ground. And then he built a fire, and the next day he was able to get a piece of his parachute out of the ground and make a canopy. So he was relatively well off, especially compared to the rest of them. And whenever those rescuers walked back in to bring him out, he said, "Welcome to my living room, boys." So I'm glad he was just glad to have somebody rescue him and to know he was going to survive this. But Robert Payne, he was just in the worst position of all of them. And like I say, he was frozen to death when they found him, and they had taken a blanket with them with hopes of finding him alive. And they had reason for optimism, considering, the co-pilot was found in good shape just maybe 12 hours earlier. But so they took this blanket, they had cut 2 saplings and used this blanket to make a travois, and they tied Payne's legs on that travois, and they drug him out of the woods towards Savage River Road. They did not come out of those woods until the next morning. These guys told me that. And so they were in those dark woods all night long. And Junior Brenneman told me he fell in Poplar Lick Run. He was wet clear up to his knees. And he said they were so cold that they had to stop several times and build a fire because they couldn't go on anymore. And Junior worked at the Harbison Walker Brick Refractory on 495 in Grantsville. And Junior said he went home, got some dry clothes on, got warmed up, and got something to eat. And he was 2 hours late getting to work, and his boss made him work 2 hours over to make up for it. So that's pretty ruthless. But anyhow, yeah, those guys told me the whole story. And Junior told me, he said when he come out of those woods the next morning on Savage River Road, he couldn't feel anything from his knees down. He said, I was 20 some years old. He said it was so close. He said, I think if I would have been 30 years old, I wouldn't have made it. And that's just, that strikes me, of all the episodes of self-sacrifice and heroism, none of these outshine that. And yet, if you would try to praise those guys, they would walk away from you. And I understood, because you don't feel like a hero when you didn't get the result that you wanted. And 50 years later, you could still sense the disappointment in those guys' voices that they didn't find him alive. But anyhow, this they had a military cordon around that crash site. First, it was the state police, the local military police units and so forth, whoever they could get in a hurry to get up there and secure the site, because the weather was so bad that it took a while for the regular Army troops to get here. And this video that I'd shown you, a friend of mine, Leo Mills, gave that to me. And I said, how did you get that? And I said, because they were seizing film out of cameras. And he laughed and he said, there's a story behind that. And they were up there, he said, the day after the crash. And he described them as two National Guardsmen, came up to them, Leo and his dad and his uncle, and they asked his uncle if he was shooting video, and he said yes. And he said, give me the camera. And this military officer ripped the camera out, the film out of it, and gave it back to him. Well, he asked Leo's dad the same question. Well, Leo's mom had sewed a pocket on the inside middle of his dad's hunting coat, and that sentry frisked him and never found that camera. That's the reason why these video clips exist today. And Leo gave me a copy of them. But this wasn't the first time that Robert Payne, the bombardier, had flown over this part of the country. In the January 1957 edition of Popular Science magazine, the cover story is it's entitled "A Night Raid in Our Hydrogen Bomber." And what it is, it's a story about the World Series of Bombers. It was a competition based on a baseball theme, and this is the cover page of the article. And if you're able to see that photo, the second photo from the left on the left-hand side, where all these guys are going through inspection, these crew members. If you look at the first guy on the left that's facing you, that's Robert Townley. That is Robert Townley. And these planes would fly from Loring Air Force Base in Maine. And the first base, so to speak, would be St. Francisville, Illinois, Richmond, Virginia, Springfield, Massachusetts, and then Montreal would be home plate. Each one of these places, they would have a radar truck. And obviously there's no bombs on these planes, but whenever this bombardier got over that target and he would hit the bomb release button, it would send a signal to that truck and they would measure the accuracy of that strike. Well, Robert Payne was the only one of the bombardiers that scored a perfect strike. And well, anyhow, I want to move on to, that was kind of like my first experience with this thing. And like I say, everybody kind of goes back to their normal life. And well, this was all revived around the time of the 50th commemoration, but for me, it was revived a year earlier. I came home one night, it was in August of 2013, and I had just posted my email address online about 2 weeks before on findagrave.com. Well, someone contacted me. I didn't recognize the sender, and they said, we are from the Orange, Texas area, and we are looking for the B-52 monuments, and it said, call anytime, and anytime was capitalized. And so I thought, well, it sounds pretty urgent, even though it's 10:30 at night. And so I called, and it was Gina Townley Swinburne, the niece of Major Robert Townley. And that was the first time that she'd been back in 49 years. And she's been back since twice. And I talked to Gina frequently, and I think she's signed in here tonight. And I hope to hear from her here in a little bit. And but I met Gina, I took them around to the monuments, and the following year, Gina came back again. She and I worked together to try to find these flight crew families. Actually, it was more Gina than it was me, but we worked together to find these flight crew families to notify them about the 50th commemoration. And well, anyhow, I think there's a picture here. this was the one from, okay, now this one was taken, this picture was taken on Friday, July 11th, 2014. This is the whole Townley family. And second from the right is Robert Townley's son, Don. And there's Gene on the left-hand side, and Gina's daughters, and Gretchen Hofferbert, Kinser, who is also another niece of Major Robert Townley. This was taken on the day before the 50th commemoration. We had just had these monuments restored. And I think we've got some pictures of the monuments, our monument restoration. I guess we're getting, so we don't run out of time. I want to cover the monument restoration. We created, I don't know if it's fair to even call us a committee, because we're just an informal group of people that had a passion for getting these monuments restored, because they were in bad shape after 50 years. And we didn't want to see these crew families see this. We didn't want this to convey the impression that we didn't care. So I signed an agreement with Wade Dorsey, manager of the superintendent with Savage River State Forest, and also the property owner at the crash site, that would allow us to get in there and fix these monuments. And you'd be surprised where the money came from. We raised, I think, $2,800 pretty quickly. $1,000 came from the Associated Gun Clubs of Baltimore, and that was through John Jocelyn, the creator of the Buzz 14 website. He was also able to get $400 from the Baltimore County Fish and Game Association. I got $500 from the Governor's Commission on Maryland Military Monuments. This is how we found the Payne Monument. It had 2 gunshot falls. It was covered with biota. We hired a professional conservator, Howard Wellman from Haworthorpe, Maryland. And these are sequential photos of the restoration of that monument. And he restored the inscription. You can read for yourself. It says at the bottom, "A good and loving husband and father." And we put new signs up. The Bedford, Pennsylvania American Legion donated the Korean War flag holder. Here we are at the crash site. This one right here, Howard Wellman. Now the one at crash site was damaged from the cows rubbing against it, using it as it was in the middle of a cattle field, using it as a scratching post. And you could see that tire in the previous photo. You could see that tire from that plane is still laying there. You see the tire from it, it's still there. There are metal parts throughout that field. And well, the field, the crash site is on private property. So trespassing, I just want to say up front that it's strictly forbidden without permission of the property owner. But we put this thing back together, and then the property owner agreed to keep his cattle in while we erected a fence. This is getting down to the final steps of the here we are. And but this isn't the final stage. We built a fence around it. This is Melvin Wooten's monument in West Salisbury, and this one didn't need a restoration. And you can see a very nice monument up here in West Salisbury. It's got a B-52. It's got an ascending angel and or a parachute and an ascending angel. But that's in West Salisbury, Pennsylvania. This one is publicly accessible. If you want to find these places, go on to Buzz 14 website, and we created the Buzz 14 Memorial Trail. We went around and took geographic coordinates and recorded driving directions. And there's a map. You can navigate by the map. You can use your smartphone, and you can get to that Townley, or the Wooten Monument is publicly accessible. Now here we are the first day. We can scan through these fairly quickly, but this just shows you the sequence. We built a fence. There we are on the first day. That's all we got done the first day. And there is the end of the second day. You can see the big rocks we had to dig out of the ground on the right-hand side. There, I think there was more rocks than there were dirt. And then Mike Beal is solely responsible for all the stone and all this concrete work, and the creation of that B-52. We had nothing to do with that. That's solely Mike Beal's work doing that. He did just a unbelievable job there. But this is what it looks like today. And so it's on private property today. Hopefully someday it'll be publicly accessible. But
Bucky, would you care if I went through the slides and you could narrate them a little bit?
not at all, not at all. Okay, now this is the flight crew collage. This gives you a good idea of what these guys look like. And Major Thomas McCormick passed away in 1996 and is buried in California. Parker MacPeden passed away in 2009. He was cremated, and the disposition of the ashes is unknown. Whenever these guys came back for the dedication or the dedication of the B-52 monument in Grantsville in 1964, MacPeden stayed with the Herbert Mike Alexander family in Westernport up on Rock Street. And Herbert's son, Mike Alexander's son, Eric and Mark, both helped with the monument restoration. Mike Alexander was instrumental in making that ceremony in 1964 happen. He wrote a letter to the White House asking for recognition for these guys, and remarkably, he got a response. And the keynote speaker was head of the Strategic Air Command, Woody's head of the Air Force, Woody Swancutt in Grantsville. So Mike had a lot to do with that dedication to that ceremony that dedicated that monument in Grantsville. But you can see these other guys. Melvin Wooten is buried in New Mexico. Robert Payne is buried in Andersonville Cemetery in Georgia, National Cemetery. Major Robert Townley is buried in Alabama. And this is the VOR beacon in Grantsville. And it is still there. There's some of the older planes that still use this for navigation. So it's on Pea Ridge Road. And it was right across the street where Wooten's ejection seat landed. And this was the newspaper story from the bombs on Thursday. The bombs were taken to Cumberland Airport. Of course, they were made safe to transport the 28th EOD unit from Fort Meade, operated on the bombs. When they were safe to transport, they took them to the airport on Thursday, loaded on a C-124 Globemaster, and taken, I don't know where, but I don't know if it was Fort Meade or where they were taken, but they were taken away. So now this was the dedication of the Payne Monument in 1964. Guys from in the front row, left to right, Cecil Broadwater, Robert Warnick, Dayton Broadwater, Tom Bender, Jim Michael, Hank Handwork, park ranger up there, and Blaine Beachy. They were members of one of these search teams that walked through that woods to try to save Robert Payne. And this is a picture that Gina Townley Swinburne sent me of their family at the dedication of the Townley Monument at the crash site in 1965. And there's a little story behind this. This is the dedication of the Melvin Wooten Monument up in West Salisbury in September of 1964. Now, Carol Wooten couldn't come back again. She had two little kids. She'd already been back in July for the B-52 the dedication of the B-52 monument in Grantsville. She couldn't come back again because they live in South Dakota. So Parker Peden and his wife accepted the flag on her behalf. But you see this little boy, we were hopeful, they identified him as Charles Peden. We were hopeful on notifying him, getting in touch with him, and having him here for the 50th commemoration. We had the hardest time finding him because Mac and Diane Peden divorced in 1967. 68, Diane Peden remarried Lieutenant Colonel Charles Arthur Colton, and this boy was adopted, so he changed his name. So once we found out what his name was, it renewed our hope of finding him. And if we go back to the previous slide, our hopes were dashed by this. We found out that he passed away 1 year before and that was a big letdown. I don't know for sure that he would have been willing to attend, but we sure would have liked to ask him. And this is a letter that was sent the following January. You can see on the anniversary of the crash, the year after the 50th commemoration, it was sent from the Wooten family. It was the family of Tech Sergeant Melvin Wooten. I had dinner at the Sand Springs in Frostburg with the Wootens before they went back to South Dakota. So they were all very thankful to see that how much everybody still cared, and these monuments were still being preserved. And this was just last year, and the Townleys were back again. This is us at the crash site. And yeah, they were back again. They love the mountains up here. And I thought I'd just throw that in. Frank Segaro is the property owner up there at the crash site. And so he's been very cooperative he's helped to take care of, cut the grass around that thing. He allowed us to get in there to work on it. And he's been a great friend to the Townleys and everybody else connected to this. But one thing I want to say about this, kind of back up a little. Now, here is the flight crew families during the 50th commemoration. This is all of them with the exception of the Copowis family. There were two members of the Copowis family that I communicated with, his sister and his cousin, but they were, his sister was in her 70s, his cousin was in her 80s, and they didn't have anybody to bring them. So what I did after the commemoration, I put together photos and programs and everything I could and sent to them. I talked to his sister on the phone, the Copowis sister, and she was in college at the time, and she didn't know about the crash until her brother had already been recovered. They thought there's no point in telling her now, getting her upset, and she was getting ready to take her final exams. And so, well, as it turned out, it had a happy ending. But I also talked to the Copowis cousin, Joyce Bowman. She's a retired nurse. And she told me that she took care of him when he was released from Memorial Hospital in Cumberland. And she said he wasn't in nearly as good a shape as what they made it sound. She said he had frostbite on his fingers and his toes both. But both the Powett and Copowis families told me the same thing. They said these guys never got over losing their friends that day. I guess we're getting close on time here. We want to leave time for people to respond. One thing I want to say here, like I say, reiterate, if anybody wants more information on this crash, to go to the Buzz 14 website. And also I've been working with an author for the past year who's writing a story about this crash. She has talked to all the flight crew families, and I'm not going to reveal the title of the book of the author. That's the author's prerogative, but she said it's okay. She said, let everybody know that the book will be out this summer. She'll have local book signings. It will be available for sale in the local bookstores. So actually I got more, but it'll never end. But there's just so much to this story.
All right. Well, thank you. I think we will open up to some questions. If you have a question or would like to ask a question, go ahead and ask in chat, just so we don't have a lot of people trying to ask at once. But if you have any questions, please let us know. I did see one in the chat. Why didn't the bombs explode on impact?
Okay, now that's a good question. See, these weren't these nuclear bombs. They required the bombardier to activate these bombs. He had a switch that had two positions. It was either in arm or safe. He would have had to turn that switch to arm, and I think the Powett had one also as a safety measure. But that would start an electronic sequence in these bombs that would start that nuclear process. But that's a good question for another reason, because what differentiates thermonuclear from nuclear, these thermonuclear bombs that were so much more powerful, what made them more powerful is that they discovered under extremely high temperature that this fission was greatly enhanced. So these things had a conventional explosive integrated into it, and this would precede the nuclear explosion. It would create this very high temperature. So the bombs couldn't have, the nuclear part couldn't have gone off. But if those bombs had not been insulated by that snow, they would have got in the middle of that fuel fire. That conventional explosive could have gone off and it would have scattered that radiation everywhere. So, and when people read that in the newspapers and the newspaper and the Air Force said the bombs weren't armed, that creates a false impression because people think that everything wasn't there to make these work. I've often heard people use the term warhead when it comes to a bomb. There are no warheads on a bomb. Missiles have warheads, bombs don't. Everything to make these things work was there.
All right, another question. How were the bombs loaded onto trucks in such a remote location, and what was used to bring them out to the roadway?
Well, there's various stories about that. I don't know. The story that I've heard more often than any others, Ray Giacone owned M&S Stone Quarry nearby. And again, I don't know this. There's different stories, but supposedly he loaded the bombs onto his dump trucks with mattresses in the boys' camp, and then they brought them out to the road, and then they were loaded onto flatbed trailers, which was in the newspaper article shown going through Cumberland. But then I heard stories from other people that were there that said that they wrapped bombs around or chains around the bomb and the bucket of a loader and moved them to the roadside that way. So I'll let the reader decide, but I've heard different stories about how that happened.
Someone wants to know what road the VOR beacon is on.
It's on Pea Ridge Road. It's off of Appleton-Lonaconing Road. It's near Appleton-Lonaconing Road and Lancaster Hill Road. When you get in that area, you'll see it miles before you get to it because it's just such a distinct looking building, and it sits on the highest peak in that whole area. You'll see it 2 miles before you get there.
Someone else said that they attended an auction and they built an old airplane seat as a seat from the crash. They aren't too sure if it was from that, but they said that it did not look similar to the one on display. Do you think that would be likely?
I couldn't say. I mean, when we were on that B-52, that 50th commemoration committee, one of our committee members was George Menser from Myersdale, PA. He's a retired B-52 mechanic. So if we could, somehow send a picture, it doesn't sound likely, but I'm not qualified to just write it off. Who knows? I mean, it could be.
You're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat and people saying just thank you for the hard work and thank you for the presentation.
We appreciate everybody signing in and appreciate the fact that so many people still remember this. And this was our whole goal by restoring the monuments and things, is to pass the story on to the next generation.
Yes, and I mean, we at the library thank you for being here as well and sharing all this wealth.
My pleasure.
Someone says, the Robert Warnick was in the photo. Do you know who the Robert Warnick was in the photo?
There was two Robert Warnicks. One Robert Warnick was the guy that owned a farmhouse where the pilot walked out. This was a different Robert Warnick. But this Robert Warnick lived down in the area of Twin Churches Road. I didn't know him, but he lived down in the area of Twin Churches Road. I was told he was never married, but this Robert Warnick was the same guy that operated that dozer that cleared that field to bring the bombs out. I was told that by people who were there, by several people who were there. He was the one that operated the dozer. And his sister still lives in Frostburg. Robert Warnick's sister still lives in Frostburg.
Any other questions? If anyone needs to unmute, to ask the question, feel free to. Someone did ask, what led you to follow and collect so much on this subject?
I've always been interested in these local historical projects, but what led me more than anything was just how coincidental it was in 2013 that Gina Townley Swinburne would contact me. And it's just to hear their stories, it just really piqued my interest, because when you talk to these flight crew families, you hear things that you've never heard before. And that's the great thing about the book that's coming out. I mean, even though there's been documentaries, the documentaries had the advantage, the audio visual cues and stuff, but there's so many facets to this. And a documentary has its advantages, but a documentary could never begin to cover the subtleties that a book can. And so long story short, just hearing all these stories I had never heard before, and I knew that there was more out there to learn.
What was the next VOB station they were to fly over?
Yeah, the VOR. I'm not sure. You know, in the radio transmissions, the only way I think they mentioned Albany. They definitely mentioned Phillipsburg, and the one down at Pulaski, Virginia, which is near Wytheville, and then they mentioned another one at Macon, Georgia. But these VOR beacons, they had a pretty short range. Depending on the range of these beacons would depend on the altitude of the plane. From 18,000 to 45,000 feet, the maximum range of that beacon would be 130 nautical miles or 150 statute miles. So these things had to be pretty close together. There was one down in Grant County, West Virginia, and they don't always say in the radio transmissions which ones they were navigating by.
And has there been any thought of forming a committee to help with future restoration and upkeep of the monuments?
We're still somewhat active with that. We've kind of stepped back, but we haven't forgot about it. The one down, I guess, on Savage River State Forest is their responsibility, and that one's hard to get to, but we haven't given up on the one at the crash site. So we plan to go back this year again and do some cleanup and stuff. And so, yeah, as long as we're alive, we're not going to walk away from it. We're going to keep up with it.
All right. I'll leave it open for one more minute, but while that's happening, I do want to remind you all that there will be a recording of this on the Allegheny County Library YouTube, and hopefully we'll have some of the questions in chat. I will also have a link to the presentation, so if you want to see the pictures for yourself, I'll try to have that linked on the YouTube video as well, but we'll post that on Facebook once that is up and live. Why were so many remnants left of the crash?
I guess that plane was coming apart, and the last at least 8 or 10 miles, there's still pieces scattered through the woods. But I'm guessing what you're asking is why there were remnants left in that field up there. There was just so much debris to start with. But I was told by people that were there that there was so much debris, which is obvious, but it was frozen in the ground. And so and when this plane came down, I talked to witnesses who were up and saw this, and they said it dug a crater about 25 feet deep and 75 to 100 yards long in that field. And what they did in order to get that debris out of the way, and to make that road to get the bombs out, they pushed some of that debris down in that hole and covered it up. And it wasn't like that they had to reconstruct this plane to know what the cause of the accident was, because this is like the third or fourth one that the tail section had broken off of.
You were just a wealth of information.
And she's asking how deep was the snow? That's another interesting question, because I talked to guys that were up there plowing snow, and they said there was snow fence up there, which they used to be pretty popular back then to keep the snow from drifting. And they said that snow was clear up over top of that fence. You could step right over it. They said it was about 3 feet deep up there.
All right. Well, thank you again, Bucky. Thanks for joining us and thanks for sharing all of your knowledge with us.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to share our story.
It seems to be quite the hit. Lots of thank yous and lots of great presentations. So yeah, thank you again. Thank you to everyone who came to the event and joined in and asked questions and just talked and just were here. Thank you. As Regina said, thank you for coming. And this has been such a lovely platform during this time when we cannot meet in person, but hopefully one day,
Yes.
one day we will have
Soon.
in-person events again. Hopefully soon. That is all I have. Any last remarks? All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming. And I hope that you all have a fantastic night.